He looked me right in the eyes and said, "Who exactly are you again?" And the whole room laughed. 300 people. My son's colleagues, his future in-laws, their friends with their expensive watches and their bigger smiles, all of them laughing, and me, standing there in the dress I'd saved 3 months to buy, holding a glass of champagne I hadn't touched, feeling the floor tilt beneath my feet. But here's what none of them knew. I had an envelope in my purse, and everything was about to change. My name is Margaret. I'm 63 years old. I worked as a registered nurse for 31 years in the same hospital in Columbus, Ohio, and I raised my son, Daniel, completely alone from the time he was 4 years old. I didn't date. I didn't take vacations. I worked double shifts on Christmas Eve and came home to wrap presents at 2 in the morning because I refused to let him feel the absence of what we didn't have. We weren't poor, but we weren't comfortable either. We were the kind of family that counted groceries at the register and called it budgeting. Daniel's father left when Daniel was 3. He didn't leave for another woman, at least not at first. He left because he said I was too serious, too tired, too focused on work. He said I had stopped being interesting. I remember standing at the kitchen sink when he told me that, washing a pot, and I didn't cry. I just kept washing the pot. I think that was the moment he decided I was beyond saving. His name was Robert. Dr. Robert Calloway. He was a cardiologist at Mercy General, same hospital where I worked. We had met there. I was a floor nurse, he was a resident, and he had this way of tilting his head when he talked to you that made you feel like you were the only person in the building. I was 26 and I fell completely. After he left, I transferred to the pediatric wing so I wouldn't have to see him in the hallways every morning. A supervisor I trusted arranged it quietly. Robert moved to the cardiology department, got promoted, got remarried within 2 years to a woman named Patricia, whose family had money and connections and a lake house in Michigan. I heard about it from colleagues the way you hear about weather, casually, as if it had nothing to do with you. I never spoke badly about Robert to Daniel. Not once. When Daniel asked why his father didn't come to his baseball games, I said his father was very busy with important work. When Daniel asked why we didn't visit his father's house, I said some families are just shaped differently, and that didn't mean anyone loved him less. I believed in protecting him from the weight of things he was too young to carry. What I didn't protect him from was the truth I discovered 3 years after Robert left. And that is the part of the story that took me 30 years to know what to do with. I was working a night shift in pediatrics when I overheard 2 nurses from cardiology talking in the break room. They didn't know I was in the supply closet just off the hallway, restocking gauze. I wasn't eavesdropping deliberately. I was tired and moving slowly, and then I heard Robert's name, and I went very still. They were talking about a patient. A 44-year-old man named Gerald Foss, who had died on Robert's table 8 months earlier. The official report listed the cause as complications from a pre-existing arrhythmia, but one of the nurses, a woman named Cynthia, who had been in the OR that night, was saying something different. She was saying Robert had made a decision, a specific, deliberate decision during the procedure, and that the attending had seen it and said nothing because Robert was already being considered for chief of cardiology. I pressed myself against the shelving and I listened. Cynthia said the patient had been a whistleblower. Gerald Foss had been an administrator at a medical supply company that had a contract with Mercy General, and he had been gathering documentation about a kickback arrangement, inflated billing, substandard equipment approved through falsified reviews. Robert's name was on those approval forms, and Gerald Foss had contacted the Ohio Medical Board 2 weeks before his surgery. I went home that morning and sat at my kitchen table until Daniel woke up for school. I watched him eat cereal, and I thought about Gerald Foss's family somewhere in Columbus who thought their father had simply died on the table. I didn't go to anyone immediately. I want to be honest about that. I was afraid. I was a single mother with a 10-year-old and a mortgage I could barely manage, and Robert still had friends in that hospital, and Cynthia had only said what she said in a break room, and I had no documentation of my own. I told myself I was waiting for the right moment. The truth is, I was terrified. But I kept my ears open. Over the following months, I paid close attention. I asked careful questions of people who didn't know why I was asking. I found out that Cynthia had been quietly transferred to a different floor 3 months after that conversation. I found out that Gerald Foss's widow had attempted to file a complaint with the hospital and had been told the matter was fully reviewed and closed. I printed what I could from public records. I held on to things. And then I told myself I had done enough, and I put it away, and I raised my son. Daniel was a beautiful child, and he became a wonderful man. He had Robert's height and my stubbornness, which I consider the best possible combination. He studied civil engineering at Ohio State, paid for largely by scholarships and my overtime, and he got a job with a firm in Cincinnati that did infrastructure work for the state. He was kind. He called me every Sunday. He remembered my birthday without being reminded, and he remembered my favorite kind of pie, which is strawberry rhubarb, and every June he brought one to me from a bakery near his apartment. He met his fiancée, Sophia, at a work conference in Chicago when he was 31. He called me that same evening, which he never does from trips, and I knew before he said anything. He talked about her for 45 minutes without stopping. I sat on my couch and smiled at the wall. I didn't meet Sophia for almost 4 months because they were both busy and the timing kept shifting. When I finally met her, we had dinner at a restaurant in Cincinnati, the 3 of us, and I liked her immediately. She was sharp and warm, and she laughed easily, and she looked at my son the way I had always hoped someone would look at my son. I didn't know who her father was until the engagement party. Daniel told me the week before. He called on a Sunday, which was normal, but his voice had a different texture to it, slightly careful, and I noticed. He told me Sophia's father was a prominent cardiologist in Columbus. He told me his name. I sat down on the floor of my kitchen, not in a chair, on the floor. I said, "How long have you known?" He said, "Since we got serious, about a year." I said, "Daniel." He said, "Mom, I know, but Sophia isn't him, and I'm not going to lose her because of something that happened between you and her father 30 years ago." I stayed very quiet for a long time. Then I said, "There is more to this than you know." He said, "Mom, please, I'm asking you. Please just come to the party and be gracious and let me have this." And because I loved him more than I loved being right, I said yes. The engagement party was held at a venue in the Short North neighborhood of Columbus. A restored building with exposed brick and catered food, and a bartender who probably made more per hour than I had made as a nurse my first 5 years. There were around 80 people. Sophia's family had money the way some families have furniture. So much of it and so long accumulated that they had stopped noticing it. I wore a navy dress with a thin gold belt. I had my hair done the day before. I brought a card for Daniel and Sophia with a handwritten note inside that I had drafted 4 times to get right. I was going to be gracious. I had decided. Robert was older, of course. We all were. He had the kind of aging that money enables, the kind where the gray looks distinguished and the extra weight looks comfortable. He stood in the center of every conversation. He shook hands with both of his hands wrapped around yours. His wife, Patricia, was thin and brittle-looking, and she wore a dress that cost more than my car payment. He didn't recognize me at first. We were on opposite sides of the room for the first hour, and I was grateful for that. I drank water. I talked to Sophia's aunt, who was lovely. I watched my son move through the room with Sophia on his arm, and I thought, whatever happens tonight, he deserves this happiness. Whatever happens, I am not going to take that from him. The trouble started when Robert made his toast. He stood at the front of the room with a microphone, and he told a story about Sophia as a little girl, sweet and funny, and everyone laughed in the right places. Then he talked about the kind of man he hoped she would marry. Someone ambitious, someone daffish, someone established, someone who understood the value of a strong family foundation. And then he looked across the room toward Daniel and he said, "We were a little surprised at first, of course. We didn't know much about Daniel's people." He said it pleasantly. He said it with a smile. Daniel's people, as if we were a category to be investigated rather than a family to be welcomed. A few people shifted in their seats. Daniel's jaw tightened. I saw it from across the room. And then Robert looked directly at me, and he tilted his head the way he used to tilt his head when he was dismissing something, and he said, still into the microphone, loud enough for everyone, "And you must be, forgive me. I'm terrible with names. You must be a family friend of Daniel's." He knew exactly who I was. I could see it in the half-second before the smile settled back into place. He knew. And he had made the calculation, right then, in front of everyone, that I was not worth acknowledging directly. That naming me as Daniel's mother would require him to engage with a history he had decided did not exist. I heard someone near me say, "Oh," very softly. I kept my face still. I set down my glass, and I said, clearly and without any particular heat, "I'm Daniel's mother. I raised him alone for 27 years. It's nice to finally meet the family he's marrying into," Robert said. Of course," and moved on immediately. And there was a polite ripple of applause that covered the moment over, like water covering a stone. And the party continued. But something had shifted in me. Something I had held in careful check for 30 years had come loose just slightly, like a bracket pulled from a wall, still attached, but no longer holding the same weight it had held before. I went to the restroom. I stood at the sink and looked at myself in the mirror for a long time. I thought about Gerald Foss. I thought about his widow trying to file a complaint and being turned away. I thought about Cynthia being quietly transferred. I thought about 30 years of documentation I had kept in a fireproof box in my closet, the kind of box you keep important papers in, the kind that survives what ordinary things don't. I had brought one document with me that night, not because I had planned to use it. I told myself I had brought it the way you carry an umbrella in uncertain weather, just to have it. I took the envelope out of my purse and I stood there holding it. It was a copy of a letter. Gerald Foss had sent it to the Ohio Medical Board 12 days before his surgery. He had documented the kickback arrangement in detail, the inflated contracts, the falsified equipment reviews, and the physician who had signed off on approvals he could not have honestly given without financial incentive. Robert's name appeared 4 times in 2 pages. I had obtained a copy through a records request years earlier, when I had finally gathered enough courage to file it, only to be told the matter had been previously reviewed and no further action was warranted. But the medical board had changed its leadership twice since then, and 8 months ago I had submitted a formal request to reopen the matter with new supporting documentation that I had spent the better part of a year assembling, including the transfer record showing Cynthia's relocation shortly after she had spoken too openly, and a statement from a former billing coordinator who had since retired and was no longer afraid. I had retained a patient advocacy attorney who worked on contingency for cases involving medical misconduct. I had done this quietly, the way I had done most things in my life, without announcement, without anyone watching. The Ohio Medical Board had notified me 6 weeks ago that the matter had been formally reopened. An investigator had been assigned. I had not told Daniel. I had been waiting for the right moment, which I had been waiting for since he was 10 years old. And I understood in that bathroom that waiting for the right moment was a way of never acting, and I was 63 years old and I was done waiting. I went back to the party. Robert was holding court near the bar, his back partially to me, talking to a group of men his age about something that was making them all nod slowly, the way men of a certain standing nod, when they are agreeing with each other about the natural order of things. I did not make a scene. I want to be very clear about that. I walked to where Daniel and Sophia were standing with a small group near the windows, and I said quietly, "Daniel, I need a few minutes with you, privately, before the evening ends." He looked at my face. He said, "Now?" I said, "Yes." We stepped into a small hallway off the main room, just the 2 of us, and I told him everything. Not loudly, not with drama. I told him what I had heard in that break room in 1997, what I had kept, what I had done about it over the years, and what was happening now. I told him about Gerald Foss and the letter and the medical board investigation. I kept my voice level. Daniel listened without interrupting. His face went through several things I won't try to describe. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Why didn't you tell me before?" I said, because you were 4 years old, and then you were 10, and then you were building a life, and I didn't want to build it on the foundation of your father's worst acts. I paused, and because I was afraid, I need you to know that part too. I was afraid, and I waited too long, and I'm sorry for that part. He was quiet again. Then he said, "Does Sophia know who her father is?" I said, "I don't know what she knows." He stood there for a long time looking at the floor. Then he looked up at me, and whatever I saw in his face wasn't anger. It was something more complicated than anger. It was the expression of a person reorganizing the structure of something they had believed was fixed. He said, "Okay." I said, "Okay." He said, "I need to talk to Sophia, and you need to let me handle this, my way. Can you do that?" I said yes, and I meant it this time without reservation. I went back to the party and I stood near the windows with my water, and I watched Robert across the room. He caught my eye once and looked away quickly. The calculation had shifted, I think. He could see that something had changed, though he couldn't know what. Sophia took it harder than Daniel initially. She came to me 2 weeks later at my house, and we sat at my kitchen table and she cried for a long time. She was not crying for her father exactly. She was crying for the version of her father she had carried, which is a different and more particular kind of loss. I sat with her and I didn't rush her, and I told her that her father's choices were not her identity and never had been. She said, "How did you survive it? All those years, knowing what you knew and just keeping going?" I said, "Daniel, that's how I survived it. I just kept my face toward him and kept going." She looked at me for a long time. Then she said, "I want you at the wedding, in the front row." I said, "I'll be there." The medical board investigation proceeded quietly over the following months. Robert retained attorneys, as powerful men do when the structures they have relied on begin to shift. There were delays and procedural maneuvers and a period of uncertainty that I'd tried not to let occupy too much of my thinking. My attorney kept me informed. I went to work, or rather I went to the part-time consulting work I had taken on since retiring, and I had Sunday calls with Daniel, and I brought strawberry rhubarb pie to his apartment in June. 6 months before the wedding, Robert's medical license was suspended pending the full outcome of the investigation. It was not a public spectacle. It was a quiet administrative action that appeared in the medical board's published decisions, which most people do not read. Gerald Foss's daughter, who was by then 38 years old and living in Portland, contacted my attorney to say thank you. I asked my attorney to pass along my phone number if she ever wanted to talk. She called on it Tuesday evening. We spoke for 2 hours. She told me about her father, who had liked crossword puzzles and grown his own tomatoes and coached her soccer team when she was 8. I told her I was sorry it had taken so long. She said that his name meaning something, finally, after all these years, was worth a great deal to her. We cried a little. We said we would stay in touch. The wedding was in September, on a Saturday, in a garden venue outside Columbus where the trees had just started to turn. Daniel wore a charcoal suit. Sophia wore a dress that had belonged to her grandmother, altered carefully, and she looked exactly like someone beginning something true. I sat in the front row. Patricia attended without Robert, who had not been invited, and she sat near the back and left quietly after the ceremony without speaking to me. I had no feelings about that one way or another. When Daniel and Sophia exchanged their vows, Daniel's voice broke slightly on the word always, and I looked down at my hands and pressed my lips together and thought about the boy who had eaten cereal at my kitchen table 30 years ago asking me if his father would come to his baseball game. And I thought about the woman I had been then, washing that pot at the kitchen sink, deciding to keep going. After the reception dinner, Sophia's mother, who had been gracious to me throughout the planning in a way that I thought must have cost her something, came to find me at my table. She sat down next to me and she said, "I don't know how to say this exactly, but thank you for how you handled everything, for how you raised him." She paused. "And for what you did about Gerald Foss." I said, "How do you know about Gerald Foss?" She said, "Sophia told me. She tells me most things." She looked out at the dance floor where Daniel and Sophia were moving slowly to a song I didn't recognize. I always knew there was something Robert had built his career on top of that wasn't solid. I didn't want to know what it was. I thought about that for a while. I thought about how many people live their whole lives in that particular arrangement, not quite knowing, not quite willing to know, choosing the stability of the structure over the truth of the foundation. I said, "Your daughter is going to be fine. She's got good instincts." She said, "She does." Then she said, "She got some of them from you, from watching how you handled yourself tonight." She stood up and straightened her dress. "I'm glad he has you." I sat at that table for a long time after she left. The music played and the candles burned lower, and my son danced with his wife, and the trees outside held onto the last of the light. I thought about the fireproof box in my closet, which was mostly empty now. I thought about 31 years of night shifts and grocery budgets and Sunday phone calls and strawberry rhubarb pie. I thought about an envelope in a purse and a decision made at a bathroom mirror, and how long it can take to finally do the thing you always knew you needed to do. I didn't need Robert to acknowledge me. I didn't need a scene or a confrontation or a moment where he stood in the center of a room and admitted everything while everyone watched. I had wanted that once, I think, in the way that people who have been wronged sometimes want the wrong to be publicly visible. But what I needed, and what I finally had, was simpler than that. My son was happy. The truth was on record. Gerald Foss's daughter knew that her father's name meant something, and I was sitting in the front row where I had always belonged.